In the summer of 1860, more than half a century after the United States had officially banned the importation of enslaved people, a small wooden schooner slipped quietly into the waters of Mobile Bay on the coast of Alabama. Hidden beneath its decks, crammed into suffocating darkness, were 110 human beings, men, women, and children, stolen from their homes and their families in West Africa. To hide the crime, the ship was dragged up a river, set on fire, and sunk to the bottom. And there it lay, for more than a century and a half, buried in the mud, holding the proof of an atrocity that many people insisted had never even happened. Then, a team of archaeologists finally found it, and when their cameras descended into that dark water and revealed what still remained, what they saw did more than stun historians. It finally gave a community of descendants the proof they had been waiting generations to hold. To understand why this single sunken ship carries such enormous weight, you have to understand the crime that first put it there. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States had outlawed the transatlantic slave trade more than 50 years earlier. Bringing captive Africans across the ocean was, by law, a crime punishable by death. But the brutal reality was that the law was rarely enforced, and in the shadows, the trade never truly stopped. And it was into that shadow that a wealthy Alabama shipbuilder named Timothy Mayer stepped, carrying a cold and cruel wager. According to the story, Mayer bet a group of men that he could defy the law entirely, sail to Africa, and bring back a shipload of captive people, right under the nose of the authorities. And he set out to do exactly that. He commissioned a schooner called the Clotilda, fitted it out with a hidden false deck, and placed it under the command of a captain named William Foster. They sailed across the Atlantic to the port of Whydah, in the kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now the nation of Benin. And there, they purchased 110 human beings. These were not nameless figures plucked from a faraway past. They were Yoruba and Fon people, members of communities with their own histories, their own beliefs, their own spoken languages, ripped violently from a thriving society in West Africa. 110 people, with names, with families, with whole lives, reduced to nothing more than cargo. The hold of that ship, just 86 feet long, became a floating prison. For weeks, those 110 men, women, and children endured the nightmare of the Middle Passage, packed in darkness, crossing an ocean they had never asked to see, toward a life of bondage they had never chosen. When the Clotilda finally crept into Mobile Bay under cover of night, the captives were smuggled ashore and divided among the men who had financed the voyage. And then, to destroy every trace of the crime, the ship was towed up the Mobile River, set alight, and scuttled into the muddy water, to sink and rot and be forgotten. But the people who had been stolen from Africa refused to be forgotten, and that is precisely where the true story actually begins. When the Civil War ended and slavery was finally abolished, 32 of the surviving captives, including a man named Oluwale Kosola, whom history would come to know as Cudjo Lewis, did something remarkable. They did not scatter. They did not surrender to despair. They banded together, they bought a piece of land just north of Mobile, and there they built a town of their very own. They called it Africatown. In that place, far from the homeland that had been stolen from them, they kept their traditions alive. They spoke their own languages. They built their own church. They raised their children in the ways of the people they had been torn from. They transformed their survival into a community, and that community is still standing today. Cudjo Lewis became the voice of that community, and he carried its memory deep into the 20th century. He lived until 1935, one of the very last living people to have crossed the ocean on the Clotilda. He told his story to the writer Zora Neale Hurston, who preserved the truth of what had been done in words that would one day reach the world. And over the years, researchers would identify others, women like Ridoshi, who lived until 1937, and Matilda McCreer, who lived until 1940, the last known survivor of them all. Today, roughly 100 of their direct descendants still live in Africatown. They are the living, breathing bridge between that dark voyage and the present day. But for all those generations, one thing was missing: the ship itself. For decades, people searched the muddy waters of the Mobile River for the wreck of the Clotilda. In 2018, a reporter believed he had finally found it, only for archaeologists to determine, to everyone's bitter disappointment, that it was a different vessel entirely. Then, in May of 2019, came the announcement that changed everything. The Alabama Historical Commission confirmed that a wreck resting along the Mobile River near a place called 12 Mile Island was, beyond any doubt, the Clotilda. And what the archaeologists found beneath that water stunned them. The Clotilda had not rotted away to nothing. Because it had been burned and sunk into the thick mud of a river, sealed away from the oxygen that would have devoured it, much of the wooden hull had survived, astonishingly well preserved, down to the present day. Cameras sent down into the dark water revealed the very bones of the ship itself, the actual vessel that had carried those 110 people across the ocean. Here, at last, was physical, undeniable proof of a crime that, for more than a century, some had tried to brush aside as mere exaggeration. But what truly moved the historians, and the descendants, was not just the wood, it was the meaning. For the people of Africatown, the discovery was something far more profound than an archaeological find. It was vindication. For generations, they had carried the story of the Clotilda in their families, passed down directly from the survivors themselves, even as the descendants of the men who financed the voyage largely denied it had ever happened. And now, finally, the river itself had given up its proof. The story was not a legend. It was not an exaggeration. It was history, written in charred timber and river mud. Since that discovery, archaeologists, historians, and the descendants themselves have worked side by side to study and to protect the wreck. Teams have used careful dives, sonar, and underwater cameras to map and document every inch of the site. Artifacts have been raised and conserved with reverence. The wreck was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, recognized not merely as a ruin, but as a sacred site, the resting place of a story that must never, ever be lost. There has even been serious discussion of raising the ship, and of building a place where the descendants and the world can finally look upon it and reckon with the truth it holds. The story also reached a far wider audience through a celebrated documentary that followed the people of Africatown as they fought to have their history recognized, reminding the world that this was never simply a question of an old shipwreck. It was always a question of justice, of memory, and of a community demanding to be believed at last. This is why those cameras in that dark river mattered so very much. They were not searching for treasure. They were searching for memory. The Clotilda is not a mystery to be solved for entertainment. It is a wound, finally brought out into the light. And what it teaches us is something we should never, ever be permitted to forget. That behind the distant, abstract word slavery were 110 real people, with real names and real grief, who somehow found the strength to survive, to build, and to pass their story down through the generations, until the world was finally ready to listen. So here's the question I want to leave you with. When the last physical evidence of an atrocity is pulled up from the mud, whose responsibility is it to make sure that story is never buried again? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. If this story moved you, share it, so that more people remember the names of those who survived the Clotilda and the community they built. And subscribe, because the stories we uncover next may be the very ones the world most needs to hear. Until next time, honor the past, speak the truth, and never let history be silenced. I am Arif Hasan, and this is AHHistory.